Beneath the desert sun, on the edge of the Giza Plateau, a single monument has endured longer than almost anything built by human hands. The Great Sphinx does not announce its age. It does not carry a signature or a date. It simply remains. For centuries, it has been cleared, buried, repaired, and studied, yet one basic question continues to surface whenever the sand is brushed away. How old is it, really? What we know comes from stone, landscape, climate, and fragmentary records. Some details align neatly with dynastic Egypt. Others sit less comfortably within that framework. The evidence does not shout. It accumulates quietly, piece by piece, across disciplines that do not always agree on how time should be measured. This video looks carefully at what is known, what can be supported, and what remains unresolved, without rushing to conclusions or leaning on speculation. Stone that refused a single date. The limestone body on the Giza Plateau sits low against the ground, cut from the natural ridge and then shaped into a human head and a lion's form. The monument is usually called the Great Sphinx, and it stands on the eastern edge of the plateau, facing the rising sun. The rock around it belongs to the Eocene limestones of the Mokattam Formation, laid down long before human settlement. What matters for a discussion of age is not the geological age of the bedrock, but the timing of the carving and the long sequence of exposure, burial, clearing and repair that left marks on the surface. Wind-blown sand has covered the Sphinx many times. Ancient graffiti, traveller reports and early photographs show alternating periods when only the head was visible and periods when more of the body was exposed. Sand acts as both a shield and a trap. It protects lower courses from wind abrasion while concentrating moisture and salts at the boundary where buried stone meets open air. That boundary shifts over centuries, and it creates different patterns of decay on the same statue. Any attempt to assign a single date based only on weathering has to account for this repeated cycle. Written references to the Sphinx begin in a way that is indirect. A granite stela set between the forepaws records a story associated with Thutmose IV, a prince of the 18th dynasty, commonly dated to the 15th century BCE. The text presents the Sphinx as a power already ancient enough to be buried in sand and already treated as a divine presence. The stela does not say who carved the monument. It presents restoration and devotion rather than first construction. The clearest early texts treat the Sphinx as an existing object to be honoured, cleared, or repaired. The physical setting connects the Sphinx to the pyramid complex of Khafre, a 4th dynasty king of the Old Kingdom, commonly placed around the mid-3rd millennium BCE. The Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple nearby are built with large limestone blocks, some of them cut from the Sphinx enclosure. Their masonry style and alignment fit the broader plan of Khafre's causeway and the plateau's 4th dynasty layout. Many Egyptologists take this architectural relationship as the most direct contextual argument for an Old Kingdom date. The argument is practical rather than poetic. Quarrying, hauling, and setting massive blocks tends to happen as part of a coordinated construction program, and the Sphinx enclosure appears to have supplied material for nearby temples. At the same time, the surface of the enclosure walls and the lower body shows complex weathering. Geologists who mapped the member layers of the limestone noted that softer beds erode faster and harder beds stand out as ledges. Some erosion follows the rock's natural stratigraphy, producing steps and hollows that do not require extreme explanations. Other features are harder to describe in one sentence, such as rounded profiles and vertical channels on parts of the enclosure walls. Researchers have debated whether these forms are mainly from wind-driven sand, from salt weathering, or from water action under past climatic conditions. The question is not whether water touched the rock, because water is present in many ways on limestone, including rainfall, dew, capillary rise, and runoff during rare storms. The narrower issue is whether particular shapes suggest prolonged wet conditions that fit an earlier climate regime. During the 20th century, the Sphinx became a site of constant intervention. Emil Barais, working for the Egyptian Antiquities Service in the 1922, cleared large amounts of sand and documented sections of the enclosure. Modern repair campaigns added blocks, mortars, and protective layers, some of which later failed and had to be removed. These repairs changed the visible surface and complicated the reading of older weathering patterns. Earlier clearances, such as Giovanni Battista Caviglia's work in 1817, also disturbed deposits and removed sand that had been stable for long periods. The modern visitor sees a monument shaped by the ancient carvers and by more than a century of heavy conservation decisions. Photographs from the 19th century capture a sphinx with different contours than the one seen today. The chest and forepaws were rebuilt with masonry in various periods, including ancient phases, and later restorations replaced or covered earlier stone. Repairs often used limestone blocks not perfectly matched to the original layers. Mortars introduced salts that migrated into adjacent surfaces. Changes like these matter because they can create false impressions of weathering speed. A patch of stone that looks heavily decayed may be a softer replacement, while a harder original bed may appear better preserved even if it has been exposed longer. Scholars who argue for a much earlier carving date often focus on the enclosure walls rather than the head, and they sometimes separate the statue into phases. The head is carved from a harder, more competent limestone, while the body and enclosure involve varied beds, including weaker layers. This difference can produce uneven erosion without requiring different ages. It can also allow a scenario in which parts of the monument were reworked later. In the public debate of the late 20th century, the geologist Robert Schoch emphasized weathering forms he interpreted as consistent with long-term rainfall, while the Egyptologist Mark Lehner emphasized the archaeological and architectural setting that links the monument to the Old Kingdom construction landscape. In print and in film discussions, the disagreement often turned on which lines of evidence should be weighted more heavily: the broader site plan and associated temples, or the surface geometry of weathered limestone in a complex environment. Material collected from the plateau provides additional anchors, though it does not settle every detail. Radiocarbon dating applies to organic material, not to carved limestone, so it relies on associated samples such as charcoal, mortar, or occupation debris. These materials can be redeposited or reused. Even when dates cluster in a general period, they describe activity near the monument rather than the moment of carving. Archaeological work around the Sphinx and nearby temples has produced Old Kingdom evidence, as well as later material from the New Kingdom and beyond, reflecting the plateau's long use and repeated restoration. Inscriptions and statue fragments from the New Kingdom show the Sphinx as a continuing focal point. Priests, officials, and visitors left traces of devotion and repair. Names of rulers appear on objects placed in the area, not as claims of first creation, but as assertions of care and authority. The monument's role as a religious and political symbol kept it in view across changing dynasties. That long afterlife affects how age is perceived, because an object that is repeatedly restored can look both ancient and newly worked in different sections. Geology adds another layer of restraint to the discussion. The Giza Plateau sits within a desert margin where climate shifted over the Holocene, including earlier phases with more rainfall than today. Even modest increases in precipitation, spread over long spans, can change a limestone surface, especially when salts and microfractures are present. Short, intense storms can cut channels quickly and expose soft beds. Groundwater movement and humidity cycles can weaken stone without obvious standing water. These processes produce patterns that are not always easy to separate in the field, particularly on a monument that has been alternately buried and exposed. The question of whether the Sphinx could be far older than dynastic. Egypt often collapses into a single headline number. The available record is not shaped like that. It consists of a carved statue set into a 4th dynasty building zone, a New Kingdom stela that treats it as already ancient, a long sequence of sand coverage and clearance, modern repair layers that alter surface readings, and weathering forms that can be described in more than one way depending on assumptions about exposure history. Each piece of evidence sits in its own category, and each category carries limits that are easy to overlook when the monument is discussed as a single event frozen in time. Records on stone, records on paper. Written material connected to the Sphinx appears later than the monument itself. The earliest surviving text directly associated with it is carved on the granite stela placed between its forepaws, commonly called the Dream Stela. The stone was set up during the reign of Thutmose IV, usually dated to around 1400 BCE. By that time, the Sphinx was already partially buried in sand. The inscription describes a young prince resting in the shadow of the head and receiving a message promising kingship in exchange for clearing the sand away. The text is damaged, and key sections are missing. It does not state who built the statue. It does not describe its original purpose. It presents the Sphinx as an established sacred presence that required maintenance. Earlier, Old Kingdom inscriptions from Giza are abundant, but they are unevenly distributed. Pyramid texts, quarry marks, work gangs graffiti, and administrative records survive in large numbers from the 4th dynasty. These texts name kings, overseers, crews, and construction phases for pyramids and temples. None of the securely dated Old Kingdom inscriptions explicitly describe the carving of the Sphinx. This absence has been noted repeatedly in scholarly literature. It does not prove non-existence at the time, but it does contrast with the otherwise detailed textual landscape of royal construction at Giza. The Valley Temple near the Sphinx contains blocks bearing quarry marks and masonry styles consistent with Khafre's reign. These marks identify work groups and construction sequences, but they do not mention a statue by name. The causeway, linking the Valley Temple to the pyramid complex, follows a planned axis that passes close to the Sphinx enclosure. The architectural relationship is visible in stone, not in words. Textual silence remains a feature, even where physical connections are clear. Later Egyptian sources continue the pattern. During the New Kingdom, the Sphinx is referred to as Horumakhet, Horus in the horizon. Inscriptions from this period frame it as a solar deity and a guardian figure. Statues of officials and votive objects placed nearby carry dedicatory texts, asking for favour or protection. These texts are formulaic. They locate the Sphinx within religious practice rather than historical narrative. No New Kingdom inscription preserved on site claims authorship of the monument or assigns it a creation date. Beyond Egypt, references appear indirectly in Greek and Roman writings. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the pyramids in detail but did not give a focused account of the Sphinx. Later authors, such as Diodorus Siculus and Pliny the Elder, mention colossal statues in Egypt, though their descriptions are brief and sometimes ambiguous. These writers relied on local guides and traditions that were already ancient by their time. Their works preserve impressions rather than construction histories. They show that the monument remained visible and noteworthy, but they do not add chronological clarity. Arabic historians writing in the medieval period provide another layer of commentary. Authors such as al-Makrizi, writing in the 15th century CE, recorded local traditions about the monuments of Giza. These accounts often blend observation, legend, and moral commentary. The Sphinx appears in these texts as an object of wonder and speculation, sometimes associated with pre-Islamic peoples or lost knowledge. These writings reflect cultural memory rather than archival continuity. They demonstrate that by the medieval period, the Sphinx was already detached from any clear, documented origin story. Travellers' accounts from the early modern period introduce more descriptive detail. European visitors from the 17th and 18th centuries recorded measurements, sketched profiles, and noted the degree of burial. Some travellers assumed a pharaonic origin without citing evidence. Others repeated classical sources. Their writings show the state of the monument before large-scale modern excavation. They also reveal how assumptions about age were often inherited, rather than argued from primary data. Administrative documents from ancient Egypt complicate the picture in another way. Papyrus records related to labour, food distribution, and quarrying survive from different periods. The famous Wadi al-Jaf papyri, dated to the reign of Khufu, describe the transport of limestone blocks for pyramid construction. These documents demonstrate the level of detail that can exist when records are preserved. They name places, officials, and timeframes with precision. The absence of comparable records for the Sphinx carving stands out when placed alongside such material, even while acknowledging that survival of documents is uneven. Epigraphic studies of the plateau show that later rulers repeatedly claimed responsibility for clearing and repairing the Sphinx. Inscriptions from the Sayyid period and the Roman era record restoration efforts. These texts focus on renewal rather than origin. They treat the monument as something inherited from deep antiquity. Restoration inscriptions are common across Egypt, and they often emphasize continuity with the past. Their language reinforces age without defining it. Modern scholarship approaches these texts cautiously. Egyptologists separate what a text says from what later readers wish it said. A claim of restoration does not imply forgotten builders, and silence does not automatically imply extreme antiquity. At the same time, The pattern of references does establish that the Sphinx functioned as an already ancient object for most of recorded history. The written record begins after the monument was already embedded in religious and political life. Translation issues also affect interpretation. Hieroglyphic texts are fragmentary, and key terms can have multiple meanings depending on context. Titles applied to the Sphinx emphasize divine roles rather than physical description. Names such as Horemakhet describe function and symbolism, not construction sequence. Later Greek and Arabic writers used their own languages and conceptual frameworks, filtering what they saw through inherited traditions. Paper records from excavation and conservation add a final documentary layer. Notes, photographs, and reports from the 19th and 20th centuries document clearing campaigns, repairs, and interpretations. These records sometimes contradict one another. Early excavators worked with limited stratigraphic control. Later teams reassessed earlier conclusions using improved methods. The modern paper trail shows how interpretations shifted over time, often influenced by the available evidence and prevailing assumptions rather than new inscriptions. When the written sources are placed side by side, a consistent feature emerges. The Sphinx appears in texts as a presence, not as an event. It is addressed, restored, described, and admired. It is rarely explained. The documents that survive do not provide a clear statement of first carving, even though they come from cultures capable of recording such information. That absence shapes how the monument is discussed, without resolving how old it is. Stone, water, and the shape of time. Limestone responds slowly to exposure, and the Giza Plateau provides a long record of that interaction. The stone used for the Sphinx and its enclosure comes from layered marine deposits, each bed formed under different conditions millions of years before carving. Some layers are dense and resist decay. Others are porous and break down more easily when exposed to air, moisture, and salts. This internal variability means that a single monument can weather unevenly, even under uniform environmental conditions. Any assessment of surface change has to begin with that constraint. The enclosure surrounding the Sphinx cuts directly into the plateau. Geologists mapping the site have identified these layers and traced them across the plateau, noting how they appear in quarries, temples, and natural outcrops. Where softer beds are exposed, recesses form. Where harder beds dominate, ledges remain. This pattern is visible throughout Giza, not only at the Sphinx. It establishes a baseline for understanding what erosion can look like without invoking unusual forces. Water interacts with limestone in several ways. Rainfall dissolves calcium carbonate slowly, widening pores and fractures. Even light precipitation, repeated over long periods, can soften exposed surfaces. In desert margins, dew and condensation also contribute moisture, especially during cooler nights. Groundwater can rise through capillary action, carrying dissolved salts that crystallize as the water evaporates. These salt crystals expand and contract, prying apart grains of stone. None of these processes require sustained rainfall. They operate quietly, accumulating effects over centuries. The modern climate at Giza is arid, but it has not always been identical to present conditions. Paleoclimate studies based on lake cores, pollen data, and regional geology indicate that North Africa experienced wetter phases during the early and middle Holocene. Grasslands extended farther north, and seasonal rains were more common than today. These changes were gradual and uneven. They did not turn Giza into a rainforest, but they altered how often stone surfaces were wetted. For limestone already exposed, even modest increases in moisture frequency can change weathering rates. Researchers examining the Sphinx enclosure have described rounded wall profiles and vertical grooves on some surfaces. These features have been compared to forms seen in other limestone contexts, including natural cliffs and quarried faces. In some cases, similar shapes develop where runoff concentrates along joints or bedding planes. In others, salt weathering produces smooth, bulbous recesses. The challenge lies in distinguishing between mechanisms when the stone has also been repaired, cleaned, and re-exposed multiple times. Wind-driven sand remains a dominant erosive force on the plateau. Sand grains carried by prevailing winds strike exposed stone, abrading softer layers more quickly than harder ones. Over time, this produces undercutting and scalloped surfaces. Where sand accumulates and then shifts, abrasion concentrates at particular heights. This creates bands of heavier wear that correspond to former ground levels. Because the Sphinx has been buried and uncovered repeatedly, its surfaces record multiple such bands, complicating any linear interpretation of erosion depth. Water does leave distinct traces under certain conditions, but context matters. In regions with sustained rainfall, limestone can develop deep channels and solution features over large areas. At Giza, rainfall is infrequent, but when storms occur, they can be intense. Short-duration downpours generate runoff that follows existing cracks and weaknesses. Over many events, these paths deepen. The resulting features can resemble those formed under wetter climates, even though the total annual rainfall remains low. Experimental and comparative studies have attempted to quantify erosion rates. Measurements taken from dated quarry faces, tomb walls, and temple blocks show wide variation. Stone quality, orientation, exposure, and human activity all influence outcomes. A block sheltered by sand for centuries may appear better preserved than one exposed for a shorter time. A repaired surface may decay faster than original stone if the replacement material is weaker. These variables make direct extrapolation risky. The head of the Sphinx presents a separate case. Carved from a harder limestone unit, it has retained sharper features than the body. This difference has been used to argue for different exposure histories. At the same time, the head has been fully exposed for longer periods, while the body was often buried. Protection by sand slows wind abrasion but can intensify salt damage at the burial line. The contrast between head and body reflects both material properties and exposure patterns, not a single factor. Modern conservation has altered surface readings further. Cement-based mortars introduced during 20th century repairs trapped moisture and salts, accelerating decay in adjacent original stone. Later interventions removed some of these mortars, replacing them with more compatible materials. Each phase left its mark. When geologists examine the enclosure today, they are reading a surface that includes ancient carving, ancient repairs, modern repairs, and natural decay superimposed on one another. Satellite imagery and laser scanning have improved documentation of surface geometry. High-resolution models capture subtle undulations and profiles across the enclosure walls. These tools allow researchers to compare erosion patterns quantitatively rather than relying only on visual impressions. They show consistency in how different limestone layers respond across the plateau. They also confirm that many features once thought unique to the Sphinx appear in other exposed cuts of similar stone. The interpretation of water-related erosion often depends on assumptions about exposure time. If a surface is assumed to have been exposed continuously since carving, certain features suggest longer durations. If the same surface is assumed to have been buried for extended periods, those features can be explained within shorter windows. The Sphinx complicates this because its burial history is well documented, but not precisely quantified. Sand levels changed in response to climate, human activity, and maintenance. Geology does not provide a date in isolation. It provides constraints. It shows what kinds of processes are capable of producing observed forms under known conditions. At Giza, those conditions include variable stone quality, fluctuating sand cover, episodic rainfall, salt activity, and extensive human intervention. Each of these leaves traces that overlap in time and space. When specialists discuss the age of the Sphinx using geological evidence, they are not reading a simple clock. They are comparing patterns, rates, and analogues. The stone records change, but it does not label it. Understanding what the stone can and cannot say is part of separating observation from inference. The surface tells a story of exposure and protection, not a single moment of origin. Alignment, orientation, and the ground beneath. The Sphinx is oriented almost due east. Its gaze aligns closely with the point on the horizon, where the sun rises at the equinoxes, though small deviations exist. Survey measurements taken over the last century show that the axis of the statue varies by fractions of a degree depending on where reference points are taken on the head and forepaws. These differences reflect both erosion and restoration. Even so, the overall orientation remains consistent with the broader east-west emphasis found across the Giza Plateau. The ground beneath the Sphinx is not level. The natural limestone ridge slopes downward from west to east, and the enclosure was cut directly into this incline. As a result, The rear of the body sits higher relative to the surrounding plateau than the chest and forepaws. This slope affects drainage. Water flowing into the enclosure during rain events tends to move eastward, pooling briefly near the forepaws before dispersing or evaporating. The floor of the enclosure shows evidence of this pattern, including shallow depressions and channels that follow the natural gradient rather than a carved plan. Nearby structures share related alignments. The causeway, traditionally associated with Khafre, runs from the valley temple toward the pyramid, passing south of the Sphinx. Its orientation is slightly offset from true east-west, reflecting adjustments made to accommodate the terrain. The valley temple itself sits at a lower elevation, closer to the ancient Nile floodplain. Its placement suggests a deliberate integration of monument, landscape, and water access, though the specific sequence of construction remains debated. Measurements taken from aerial photography and satellite imagery show that the Sphinx enclosure cuts into the plateau in a way that predates some surrounding features while intersecting others. The southern enclosure wall lies close to the causeway, leaving a narrow strip of bedrock between them. This proximity has been used to argue for coordinated planning. At the same time, the enclosure's irregular shape follows the contours of the limestone ridge, rather than an abstract geometric ideal. The walls bend and adjust where harder or softer beds appear, indicating responsiveness to local conditions during excavation. Orientation studies extend beyond simple compass directions. Researchers have examined how the Sphinx relates visually to the horizon line, the Mokattam Hills to the east, and the desert escarpment to the west. From the level of the enclosure floor, the horizon appears compressed, with the head rising against open sky while the body remains partially framed by stone walls. This visual effect changes depending on sand levels. When the enclosure fills with sand, the monument appears shorter and more integrated with the plateau. When cleared, the contrast between carved form and natural ridge becomes sharper. Subsurface investigations provide additional context. Geophysical surveys using seismic refraction and ground-penetrating radar have mapped variations in bedrock density beneath and around the Sphinx. These studies show fractures and fissures consistent with natural jointing in limestone, rather than hidden chambers of regular shape. Some anomalies correspond to known cavities or repairs. Others reflect changes in moisture content or stone quality. The data suggests that the monument was carved into a complex geological setting, not a uniform block. The plateau itself was shaped by quarrying long before and after the Sphinx was carved. Blocks removed from nearby areas supplied material for pyramids, temples, and later structures. Quarry scars, ramps, and spoil heaps are visible across the landscape. These features show how builders worked with the ridge, rather than flattening it entirely. The Sphinx enclosure fits within this pattern. It represents an extreme case of subtractive carving, where the monument emerges from the removal of surrounding stone. Elevation measurements highlight subtle relationships. The head of the Sphinx sits at a height comparable to certain courses in nearby temples, while the forepaws rest closer to the level of the valley temple floor. These correspondences are approximate rather than exact. They reflect the natural slope more than a precise architectural grid. Over time, subsidence and repair have altered these levels slightly, further blurring any original alignment. Astronomical alignment has been discussed in relation to the Sphinx, but the physical data remains straightforward. It does not track solstice extremes precisely, nor does it align with a single star or constellation based on fixed measurements alone. Changes in Earth's axial tilt and precession mean that any stellar alignment would shift over millennia. Without contemporary textual confirmation, orientation data describe geometry, not intention. The ground beneath the monument also records human modification. Drainage channels cut into the enclosure floor during modern restorations aim to divert water away from vulnerable stone. These channels follow practical lines dictated by slope rather than historical precedent. Earlier phases of repair may have altered floor levels or added stone pavements, though evidence is fragmentary. Each intervention changes how the monument interacts with rainfall and groundwater. Surrounding sediment layers preserve a partial history of sand accumulation. Stratified deposits found during excavations include wind-blown sand, construction debris, and organic material from later occupation. These layers show alternating periods of neglect and attention. When maintenance ceased, sand advanced. When clearing campaigns occurred, the enclosure reopened to air and water. The timing of these cycles affects how the monument's orientation and exposure are experienced in different periods. The relationship between the Sphinx and the Nile has shifted as well. In the Old Kingdom, the floodplain lay closer to the plateau. Seasonal inundation reached nearer to the valley temple than it does today. This proximity influenced how monuments were approached and perceived. Over time, silting and river migration increased the distance. Orientation toward the east retained symbolic consistency, even as the physical context changed. Taken together, alignment and placement show a monument embedded in its landscape rather than imposed upon it. The Sphinx follows the ridge, faces the rising sun, and sits within a network of structures adapted to slope and stone quality. These features can be measured and mapped. They describe relationships in space without fixing a moment in time. Hands that cleared the sand. Sand moves steadily across the Giza Plateau. Wind patterns shift with seasons, and fine grains accumulate against obstacles, filling depressions and smoothing contours. The Sphinx sits at a low point relative to parts of the plateau, which encourages burial. Over time, the enclosure acts as a basin. Sand enters, settles, and compacts. Clearing it requires sustained labour, and when that labour stops, accumulation resumes. The history of the monument is therefore inseparable from the history of those who removed sand from around it. The earliest documented clearance associated with the Sphinx is recorded indirectly. The granite stela erected during the reign of Thutmose IV describes a statue buried up to the neck. The text emphasizes divine favor and royal obligation, but it implies a practical action. Sand was removed. The scale of that effort is not specified. No administrative papyri survive that list, laborers, tools, or duration. The record preserves intention rather than method. Archaeological traces suggest that clearing episodes occurred repeatedly during the New Kingdom. Debris layers in the enclosure include compacted sand mixed with fragments of stone and pottery from this period. These deposits indicate activity near the monument, including offerings and repairs. Clearing likely proceeded in stages, focusing first on the head and chest, then extending toward the forepaws. Partial clearance would have improved access for ritual use without exposing the entire body. Later dynasties continued similar practices. Inscriptions from the Site period refer to restoration and reverence. These texts often follow standard formulas, praising renewal and continuity. They do not describe technical details, but they imply organized work. Clearing sand from an enclosure of this size requires coordination. Baskets, sleds, and ramps would have been used, as in other large-scale earth-moving tasks documented elsewhere in Egypt. The absence of explicit descriptions reflects the routine nature of such labor, rather than its insignificance. Roman period activity left additional marks. Graffiti carved into the stone near the Sphinx record names and dates. Some are placed at heights that suggest the body was more exposed than in earlier centuries. Roman administrators also undertook repairs across Egypt, often reusing earlier monuments. At Giza, clearing the Sphinx would have served both symbolic and practical purposes, maintaining access for visitors and preserving a landmark along established routes. After the Roman period, maintenance declined. Medieval Arabic sources describe a Sphinx that was again largely buried. Travelers noted only the head rising above the sand. Local populations interacted with the monument in limited ways, sometimes attributing protective or harmful powers to it. They reflect a landscape where sand movement had outpaced organized clearing. The early modern period introduced new phases of intervention. In 1817, Giovanni Battista Caviglia led an excavation that cleared sand from around the chest and forepaws. His work relied on manual labor and basic tools. Notes from the period describe the difficulty of keeping areas clear as sand returned quickly. Caviglia's efforts exposed masonry repairs and fragments, but they did not reach the enclosure floor. The monument remained partially buried. Subsequent expeditions followed similar patterns. Auguste Mariette conducted work in the mid-19th century, focusing on documentation and limited clearance. Photographs from this era show incremental changes in exposure. The head appears cleaner, while the body remains encased. Each intervention altered surface conditions by changing airflow, moisture exposure, and salt movement. These changes affected decay rates in ways not immediately visible. A more extensive campaign began in the early 20th century under Émile Barrès. Working for the Egyptian Antiquities Service, Barrès cleared the enclosure more completely between 1925 and 1936. His team removed large volumes of sand, reaching the bedrock floor. The work revealed the full length of the body and the enclosure walls. It also exposed areas that had been protected for centuries. Documentation from the period includes photographs, drawings, and reports that record the state of the stone at the moment of exposure. Clearing at this scale introduced new challenges. Once exposed, the lower body and enclosure walls faced wind, temperature changes, and moisture for the first time in generations. Deterioration accelerated in some areas. Barrès' team undertook repairs using the materials available at the time, including cement-based mortars. These materials were strong but chemically incompatible with the limestone. Over subsequent decades, salts accumulated around repair zones, causing adjacent original stone to flake and crumble. Mid-20th century conservation continued the cycle of intervention. Engineers installed drainage channels to manage water during rare storms. Masonry blocks were added to stabilize weakened areas, particularly along the chest and forepaws. Each addition changed how sand and water moved around the monument. The enclosure, once a basin for sand, became a controlled space with defined drainage paths. These changes improved access, but altered natural accumulation patterns. Labor practices during these modern clearances differed from ancient methods. Mechanical equipment supplemented manual work. Trucks removed sand from the site rather than redistributing it nearby. This removal reduced immediate reburial but increased exposure. The monument entered a new phase, one defined by constant visibility rather than alternating burial and exposure. Documentation from the late 20th century reflects growing concern about the consequences of clearance. Conservation reports note increased cracking, surface loss, and biological growth on exposed stone. Efforts shifted toward stabilizing rather than uncovering. In some areas, partial reburial with sand was considered as a protective measure. This marked a reversal of earlier assumptions that visibility equaled preservation. The act of clearing also shaped interpretation. When the enclosure walls were fully exposed, their weathering patterns became central to debates about age and environment. Observations made immediately after clearance carried weight, even though the surfaces were newly exposed. Later deterioration complicated comparisons. Photographic archives allow researchers to track changes over decades, showing how quickly conditions can evolve once sand is removed. Clearing campaigns affected surrounding deposits as well. Stratified sand layers were disturbed, removing evidence of earlier accumulation phases. While some records were kept, early excavations did not follow modern stratigraphic standards. Information about the timing and sequence of sand deposition was lost. This limits the precision with which burial history can be reconstructed. Throughout its history, the Sphinx has depended on human labor to remain visible. When clearing occurred, the monument entered cycles of repair and decay driven by exposure. When clearing stopped, sand returned, slowing some forms of erosion while encouraging others. These alternating states define the physical record. The stone bears marks not only of carving and weathering, but of hands that shoveled, carried, repaired, and rebuilt. The history of clearing is therefore not a single episode, but a repeated process. Each phase responded to immediate needs, whether religious, administrative, or touristic. Each phase left material traces that affect how the monument appears today. The sand that once concealed the Sphinx also preserved it in parts. The hands that cleared it revealed surfaces that now require constant care, faces, features, and altered stone. The surface of the Sphinx is not uniform. From the crown of the head to the base of the enclosure walls, the stone records different episodes of carving, decay, and repair. These episodes are visible as changes in texture, edge sharpness, tool marks, and material composition. When examined closely, the monument appears less like a single finished sculpture and more like a surface repeatedly adjusted over time. The head draws immediate attention because it appears more intact than the body. Facial features remain legible despite loss of detail. The nose is missing, the beard is fragmented, and the mouth edges are worn, but the overall form persists. Geological analysis shows that the head is carved from a harder limestone layer than much of the body. This bed resists erosion more effectively. The difference in material strength alone accounts for part of the contrast, without requiring differences in age. Tool marks on the head have been studied through close-range photography and surface scanning. Some areas preserve straight chisel lines, consistent with known Old Kingdom stoneworking techniques. Other areas are smoother, with edges softened by erosion or later reworking. The crown shows flattening that may result from recutting or from prolonged exposure. No single tool signature dominates the entire head, suggesting that multiple interventions occurred. The body presents a different surface record. The torso and flanks are carved from alternating limestone beds, some of which crumble easily when exposed. These beds have receded at different rates, producing a stepped appearance along the sides. In places, stone has fallen away entirely, leaving cavities that were later filled with masonry. The boundaries between original rock and repair blocks are visible, as straight joints and changes in colour. The chest and forepaws are largely reconstructed. Ancient repairs used limestone blocks fitted into eroded areas, sometimes carved to approximate the original form. These blocks weathered differently from the surrounding stone. Later repairs added additional layers, some overlapping earlier work. The result is a composite surface, where original carving, ancient patching, and modern restoration sit side by side. Photographs taken before major 20th century restorations show deeper recesses and sharper damage in the lower body than is visible today. These images provide a baseline for assessing change. When compared with later photographs, they reveal areas where stone loss accelerated after exposure. They also show where repairs altered contours, smoothing irregularities or reinforcing weakened zones. The enclosure walls preserve another record of surface change. Vertical grooves, rounded hollows, and sharp fractures appear at different heights. Some of these features align with known limestone bedding planes. Others cut across layers, following joints or fractures. In places, tool marks from quarrying remain visible, especially where later erosion has been limited. These marks indicate the direction and sequence of excavation, rather than sculptural finishing. Surface discoloration adds another layer of information. Darkened patches result from biological growth, pollution, or chemical reactions between stone and mortar. Lighter patches often mark replacement blocks or areas where surface layers have flaked away. Salt efflorescence appears as white crusts in sheltered zones, particularly near repair joints. These visual cues help distinguish older stone from newer additions. The beard fragments provide a specific case of alteration. Pieces recovered from the sand, and now held in museums, show carved detail consistent with royal iconography. The beard was likely attached separately, possibly during a later phase of modification. The absence of clear attachment scars on the chin complicates reconstruction. The beard's existence demonstrates that the monument's appearance changed even within ancient periods. The Nemi's headdress shows similar complexity. Folds are unevenly preserved, with some sections sharper than others. The edges of the headdress blend into the head in places, suggesting recutting. Comparisons with other royal statues indicate stylistic consistency with Old Kingdom forms, but stylistic analysis alone does not fix a date. Stone condition and repair history influence how style is perceived. Modern conservation introduced new surface elements. Cement-based mortars, applied in the 20th century, filled cracks and cavities. These mortars were later identified as harmful because they trapped moisture and salts. Their removal left scars and rough edges where original stone had already deteriorated. Replacement mortars improved compatibility, but did not restore lost material. Laser scanning and photogrammetry have allowed precise mapping of these features. Digital models capture millimeter-scale variations across the surface. By comparing scans taken years apart, researchers can identify areas of active loss and relative stability. These comparisons show that deterioration is uneven, and often linked to repair zones rather than original carving. The face itself has been a focus of debate because it carries symbolic weight. Measurements of facial proportions have been compared to statues of known kings. Results vary depending on which features are emphasized and how erosion is accounted for. Some comparisons rely on reconstructions that smooth damaged areas, introducing assumptions. Others measure existing surfaces, which may not reflect original contours. The stone does not preserve a neutral reference state. Damage to the nose is often attributed to deliberate destruction, though evidence remains limited. Historical accounts describe removal by individuals or groups, but these accounts were written centuries after the fact. The fracture surface shows irregular breakage consistent with mechanical force, but dating that event is not possible from stone alone. The absence of the nose affects how facial proportions are perceived and reconstructed. Surface wear on the pores and base reflects human contact. These areas were touched, walked on, and repaired repeatedly. Smoothness in certain zones corresponds to frequent access. Inscriptions carved into nearby stone indicate periods of visitation. The enclosure walls preserve fewer repairs than the body, but modern interventions altered them as well. Drainage channels cut into the floor changed water flow. Protective coatings applied and later removed affected surface chemistry. These changes complicate attempts to read original weathering forms. What remains consistent is that no part of the monument is untouched. Every surface shows evidence of change. Some changes are slow and natural, others are abrupt and human-driven. The accumulation of these alterations produces the present form. When features are described as ancient or modified, the distinction often rests on probability rather than certainty. The stone records sequence but not dates. It shows where material was removed, replaced, or reshaped. The Sphinx's face and body therefore function as layered documents. Each layer corresponds to an interaction, whether carving, clearing, repairing, or weathering. Reading these layers requires separating material properties from human decisions. The altered stone does not resolve questions of origin. It documents a long process of change, context without a builder. Modern scholarship approaches the Sphinx through fragments rather than a single narrative. Archaeology, geology, epigraphy, and conservation science each contribute data, but none provides a complete account of origin. Instead of a builder's name or a dated inscription, researchers work with associations, material properties, and sequences of use. This creates a context defined by limits as much as by findings. Archaeological context relies on association. The Sphinx sits within a landscape dominated by Old Kingdom monuments, particularly those linked to Khafre. Temples, causeways, and quarries nearby share materials and construction techniques. These relationships are observable and measurable. They support a working framework in which the Sphinx belongs to a broader building program. At the same time, association does not equal documentation. Archaeology can show proximity and sequence, but it does not record intention unless texts survive. Epigraphy introduces a different constraint. Inscriptions preserve names, titles, and acts, but they survive unevenly. Stone inscriptions favor durable contexts and ceremonial language. Administrative papyri favor routine detail, but rarely survive in open-air settings. At Giza, the balance tilts towards stone texts that emphasize kingship and cult rather than technical description. The Sphinx appears in these texts as an object of devotion and repair. The absence of a carving record remains a fact of the corpus, not a gap that can be filled by analogy alone. Geology contributes observations about stone and surface change. It identifies processes capable of producing observed forms. It sets bounds on rates under given conditions. Geology does not assign cultural dates. When geological descriptions are used to suggest chronology, assumptions about exposure history must be stated. Without those assumptions, geological evidence remains descriptive. This distinction is emphasized in peer-reviewed work, where claims are evaluated by how clearly they separate observation from inference. Conservation science adds another layer. Records from restoration campaigns document what was found at the moment of exposure and what materials were added or removed. These records show how surfaces changed after clearance and repair. They also demonstrate how interventions can obscure earlier conditions. Conservation reports often caution against overinterpreting features altered by modern materials. This caution affects how older observations are weighed, particularly when photographs show rapid change after exposure. Methodology governs how these disciplines interact. In academic practice, claims are constrained by what a method can legitimately support. Archaeology favours stratigraphy and context. Epigraphy favours textual certainty and provenance. Geology favours process-based explanation. Conservation favours material compatibility and stability. When conclusions require combining these methods, the weakest link limits the claim. This is why many publications stop short of assigning precise ages beyond established cultural periods. Debate within the field reflects these constraints. When scholars disagree, the disagreement often centers on weighting rather than data presence. One side may prioritize architectural context, another may emphasize surface morphology. Peer review evaluates whether interpretations follow from stated premises. It does not resolve disputes where premises differ. Terminology also matters. Words like older, earlier, or ancient can carry different meanings across disciplines. In geology, ancient may refer to millions of years. In Egyptology, it may refer to pre-dynastic periods. Precision requires specifying scales. Without that specification, discussions risk sliding between registers. Academic writing attempts to prevent this by defining terms and limiting scope. Absence of evidence is treated cautiously. In scholarship, it is not equivalent to evidence of absence. The lack of a construction inscription does not demonstrate that none ever existed. Stone surfaces weather, blocks are reused, and texts are lost. At the same time, repeated absence across a well-documented corpus is noted as a pattern. This pattern influences probability assessments without becoming proof. Comparative material is used to test plausibility. Other monuments from the Old Kingdom are compared for documentation density. Some projects are richly attested, others are not. The variation shows that record survival is inconsistent. Comparisons help establish expectations, but do not dictate outcomes. Each site retains its own preservation history. Chronological frameworks rely on convergence. When multiple independent lines of evidence point to the same period, confidence increases. At Giza, convergence exists at the level of the 4th dynasty landscape. Divergence appears when focusing narrowly on specific features or processes. Scholars often state conclusions with qualifiers that reflect this balance. Such qualifiers are not hedges, they are methodological signals. Public discourse often compresses these signals. Academic caution can appear as uncertainty, while firm statements can appear as dogma. Within scholarship, both are regulated by citation, method, and review. Claims are revised when new data emerge or when methods improve. The Sphinx has been subject to this process for more than a century, with interpretations shifting as documentation improved. Technological advances continue to refine context. High-resolution mapping, materials analysis, and digital archives allow closer comparison of surfaces and texts. These tools increase precision but do not replace missing records. They can show how features relate, not who initiated them. Methodological restraint remains necessary. Institutional context also shapes research. Permits, conservation priorities, and national heritage policies influence what can be studied and how. Excavation near the Sphinx is limited by preservation concerns. Non-invasive methods are favoured. This protects the monument but constrains data collection. Methodology adapts to these limits. Interdisciplinary collaboration is encouraged but structured. Joint studies define roles and boundaries. Geological input informs archaeological interpretation without dictating it. Textual analysis frames historical context without overriding material evidence. Successful collaboration depends on maintaining these distinctions. When they blur, interpretations become vulnerable to critique. The scholarly record preserves disagreements as well as agreements. Articles respond to one another through measured language and specific rebuttals. This exchange refines questions even when answers remain open. The Sphinx benefits from this process because it forces clarity about what is known, what is inferred, and what is unknown. In this context, the lack of a named builder is not an anomaly unique to the Sphinx. Many ancient works lack explicit authorship. What distinguishes the Sphinx is its prominence within a well-studied landscape. That prominence amplifies the impact of missing documentation. Methodology determines how that impact is handled. The monument is therefore discussed within a framework that accepts partial knowledge. Each discipline contributes constraints that limit what can responsibly be said. The result is a context defined by evidence boundaries rather than narrative closure. Climate, memory, and the long plateau. The Giza Plateau has not existed under a single set of conditions. Over thousands of years, its climate, vegetation, and patterns of use changed gradually. These changes shaped how monuments were built, exposed, buried, reused, and remembered. Any discussion of age takes place against this shifting background rather than a fixed environment. During the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, North Africa experienced periods of increased rainfall compared to today. Lakes formed in regions that are now desert. Grasslands expanded, supporting animal and human populations across wide areas. This broader environmental context is documented through pollen records, sediment cores, and fossil assemblages collected far from Giza, but relevant to the region as a whole. The plateau itself shows indirect signs of these shifts through erosion patterns, soil development, and ancient drainage features. As rainfall declined, landscapes transitioned unevenly. The Nile Valley remained a stable corridor of water and fertile land, while surrounding areas became increasingly arid. The Giza Plateau sat at the margin between these zones. It was close enough to the floodplain to support construction and settlement, but high enough to remain dry during inundation. This position made it suitable for monumental building across multiple periods, regardless of gradual climatic change. Climate affects stone through exposure cycles rather than sudden transformation. Periods with slightly higher humidity increase chemical weathering. Periods of extreme dryness favor salt crystallization and wind abrasion. These effects accumulate slowly. The stone surfaces of the plateau record these processes in combination, making it difficult to isolate a single climatic phase as dominant. Instead, the surface reflects alternating regimes acting over long spans. Vegetation on the plateau has always been sparse, but its extent varied. When grasses were more common, they stabilized surface sediments. Reduced vegetation allowed sand to move more freely. This shift influenced how quickly monuments were buried or exposed. Sand accumulation around the Sphinx is not solely a function of wind direction. It also depends on how firmly the surrounding surface was held in place by plant cover. Human land use reinforced these patterns. Quarrying removed protective layers of stone and soil. Construction altered drainage. Roads and causeways changed how water and sediment moved across the plateau. Each generation modified the landscape slightly, creating cumulative effects. The plateau visible today is the result of both natural change and sustained human intervention. Cultural memory interacted with these environmental shifts. Monuments that remained visible were incorporated into ritual and administration. Those that became buried faded from daily use but persisted in tradition. The Sphinx moved between these states repeatedly. When visible, it attracted attention, offerings, and repairs. When buried, it receded into background awareness, preserved more by neglect than by care. Written memory does not track these transitions evenly. Texts survive from periods of intense activity and formal administration. They are scarce from times of reduced state presence. As a result, memory appears concentrated in certain eras, even though the physical monument persisted continuously. Later populations encountered the plateau under different conditions. The Nile floodplain had shifted slightly, and the distance between river and plateau increased. The Sphinx was already an inherited monument. Its meaning was shaped by what could be seen and what was remembered, rather than by knowledge of original circumstances. Medieval and early modern observers encountered a plateau dominated by sand. Their descriptions emphasize isolation and antiquity. Climate during these centuries favored accumulation rather than clearance. Reduced centralized authority limited large-scale maintenance. These accounts reflect environmental reality as much as cultural interpretation. Climate also affects preservation indirectly through human response. Periods of prosperity and stable governance encourage clearing and repair. Periods of instability allow sand to advance. These cycles align imperfectly with climate records but interact with them. The Sphinx's physical state at any given time reflects both environmental conditions and the capacity of societies to respond. Archaeological layers on the plateau preserve traces of these interactions. Wind-blown sand layers alternate with construction debris and occupation material. Organic remains indicate limited but persistent human presence. These layers do not form a continuous timeline, but rather a series of snapshots. Each snapshot captures a moment when climate, land use, and attention intersected. Memory of the plateau also shifted through reinterpretation. Names changed. Functions evolved. The Sphinx became a solar deity, a guardian, a symbol of kingship, and later a relic of an imagined past. These meanings did not replace one another cleanly. They accumulated. Each era projected its own understanding onto a monument shaped by earlier conditions. Climate science provides boundaries for these interpretations. It establishes what environmental conditions were plausible at given times. It does not prescribe cultural meaning. When climate data are used to suggest dates, the link must be explicit. Increased rainfall does not automatically imply monument construction, just as aridity does not imply abandonment. Climate constrains possibility rather than dictating action. Long-term stability of the plateau allowed memory to persist, even as details were lost. The ridge did not erode away. The monuments remained in place. This continuity encouraged the perception of great age regardless of actual chronology. A structure that outlasts many generations acquires antiquity through endurance alone. The Sphinx occupies a particular position within this landscape. It is carved from the plateau rather than built upon it. This makes it appear inseparable from the ground itself. As climate altered surface conditions, the monument altered with them. Burial made it seem dormant. Exposure made it appear renewed. Neither state erased its presence entirely. Environmental reconstruction shows that no single climatic phase explains all observed features. The plateau experienced variability within limits. Human response filled the gaps. Clearing, repair, neglect, and reuse interacted with climate to produce the present condition. Memory, once detached from documentation, relies on visible cues. Weathered stone suggests time. Partial burial suggests antiquity. Restoration suggests continuity. These cues influence interpretation even when evidence is incomplete. Over centuries, such impressions become embedded in cultural understanding. The long plateau therefore functions as both a physical and mnemonic space. Climate shapes stone and sand. Human activity shapes exposure and repair. Memory shapes meaning. These forces operate simultaneously, without coordination, over long periods. Understanding the Sphinx within this context requires attention to scale. Climate operates over millennia. Human regimes operate over centuries. Individual interventions operate over years. The monument absorbs all of these without resolving them into a single narrative. The plateau does not preserve intention. It preserves interaction. Climate leaves traces that intersect with labor and belief. Memory bridges gaps where records fail. The result is a landscape that resists simple dating, not because information is hidden, but because it was never singular, time measured without a clock. Age is not always recorded directly. At sites where inscriptions, dates, or datable organic material are absent, time is inferred through comparison and sequence. This method does not produce a single number. It produces ranges, overlaps, and relative positions. The Sphinx is one such case. Without a carving inscription or securely datable construction layer, its age is approached indirectly, using tools designed to limit possibility rather than declare certainty. Relative chronology forms the foundation of this approach. Objects, structures, and surfaces are compared based on their relationships to one another. If one feature cuts into another, it is later. If one layer lies beneath another, it is earlier. At Giza, the Sphinx enclosure cuts into the natural limestone ridge. The temples nearby reuse blocks quarried from that cut. What it does not establish is how much earlier quarrying occurred, or whether carving the statue and cutting the enclosure were simultaneous acts. Material comparison extends this logic. limestone blocks used in surrounding temples can be traced back to specific beds exposed in the Sphinx enclosure. Petrographic analysis identifies grain size, fossil content, and cement structure. These matches show shared source material. They do not, on their own, prove shared timing. Stone can be quarried, stockpiled, and reused. In practice, large-scale ancient construction often favoured immediate use. But this remains an inference based on efficiency rather than documentation. Tool marks provide another comparative measure. Chisel widths, stroke patterns, and surface finish are compared across monuments. At Giza, tool marks on temple blocks, quarry faces, and parts of the Sphinx show broad consistency with Old Kingdom techniques. These techniques are characterized by copper tools supplemented with stone hammers and abrasives. Similar marks appear across the plateau. This consistency supports a general technological horizon. It does not exclude the possibility of earlier use of similar tools, as stoneworking traditions change gradually. Weathering rates are sometimes introduced to estimate exposure time. This approach depends on knowing initial conditions, environmental variables, and material properties. In controlled settings, limestone weathering can be measured over decades. Extrapolating those rates backward over millennia introduces uncertainty. At Giza, variation in stone quality and exposure history complicates estimates further. Surfaces that appear deeply eroded may have been exposed longer, or they may simply be weaker stone. Stratigraphic comparison is limited at the Sphinx because extensive early clearing disturbed deposits. Where intact layers remain, they show alternating sand and debris. These layers indicate cycles of burial and activity. They do not directly date carving. Organic material suitable for radiocarbon dating is rare in primary contexts. When present, it dates human presence, not stone modification. This distinction is emphasized in archaeological method to avoid conflating association with causation. Radiocarbon dating is sometimes invoked through indirect means. Mortars used in ancient repairs may contain charcoal or organic fibers. Dating these materials can provide termini post-quem for repair episodes. Such dates show that repairs occurred by a certain time. They do not indicate when original carving took place. At the Sphinx, repair phases span many periods, from ancient to modern. Radiocarbon results, therefore, produce a layered timeline rather than a starting point. Comparative monument analysis provides another relative measure. Sculptures and reliefs securely dated to the Old Kingdom are compared stylistically and technically to the Sphinx. Proportions, carving conventions, and symbolic elements are examined. Similarities support contemporaneity within a broad cultural framework. Differences may result from scale, material, or later modification. Style is influenced by preservation state, making comparisons sensitive to reconstruction choices. Astronomical methods are sometimes proposed for relative dating. In theory, a monument aligned to a specific star or solar position could be dated by calculating when that alignment was exact. In practice, this requires precise original alignment, unaltered orientation, and clear evidence of intent. At Giza, orientation measurements show general eastward alignment rather than precision to a single astronomical event. Without textual confirmation, astronomical dating remains speculative and is treated cautiously in academic contexts. Erosion analysis can be framed in relative terms rather than absolute rates. Surfaces are compared to one another to determine sequence of exposure. At the Sphinx, some enclosure walls appear more weathered than adjacent quarry faces. This suggests longer or different exposure histories. It does not convert directly into years. Relative erosion can establish that one surface predates another, but only within the limits of known burial and repair cycles. Historical context contributes temporal bounds. The Sphinx is referenced as ancient by the New Kingdom. This establishes a minimum age relative to that period. Architectural association with Fourth Dynasty complexes establishes a maximum plausible age within mainstream scholarship. Between these bounds lies a span measured in centuries, not days. Relative chronology narrows this span without fixing a point. The absence of a clock does not imply absence of structure. Archaeological reasoning builds timelines from overlapping constraints. Each constraint eliminates possibilities. The remaining range reflects what can be said responsibly. For the Sphinx, that range has been debated, but the method remains consistent. Claims are evaluated based on how well they respect known constraints. Uncertainty is managed through transparency. Scholars specify which assumptions underlie their estimates. For example, an erosion-based argument must state assumptions about exposure duration and environmental stability. An architectural argument must state assumptions about construction, planning, and material logistics. When assumptions differ, conclusions diverge. Peer review focuses on whether assumptions are justified, not on whether conclusions are appealing. Chronological models are revised as new data appear. Improvements in scanning, materials analysis, and documentation refine relative relationships. They rarely produce absolute dates in isolation. This is typical for stone monuments without inscriptions. The process favors incremental refinement over definitive resolution. Public presentations often compress this process into simplified claims. In academic practice, such compression is avoided. Relative dating is presented as a framework, not a verdict. The Sphinx's age is therefore discussed in terms of plausibility ranges rather than fixed numbers. This approach aligns with method rather than narrative preference. The distinction between measurement and interpretation is central. Measurement records orientation, erosion depth, material composition, and stratigraphy. Interpretation links these measurements into temporal sequences. When interpretation exceeds measurement, it is flagged as hypothesis. This boundary maintains credibility within the field. Time without a clock is measured by accumulation. Stone accumulates marks. Landscapes accumulate modification. Texts accumulate references. None of these accumulate evenly. The resulting record is uneven by nature. Archaeological method adapts to this by working with partial sequences rather than complete timelines. At Giza, accumulation is evident everywhere. The plateau carries layers of quarrying, building, abandonment, and reuse. The Sphinx carries layers of carving, erosion, repair, and clearing. These layers overlap rather than align cleanly. Relative dating sorts them without forcing alignment. The absence of a direct date is not unique to this monument. Many ancient structures are dated through similar means. What distinguishes the Sphinx is the intensity of scrutiny applied to those means. Its prominence magnifies methodological limits that exist elsewhere. Time measured without a clock remains time measured. It is bounded, constrained, and ordered, even if not numbered. The Sphinx occupies a position within that order, defined by relationships rather than timestamps. Understanding that position requires patience with uncertainty and attention to method. Why the question persists. The question of the Sphinx's age continues not because evidence is absent, but because evidence is incomplete in specific ways. The monument exists at the intersection of several disciplines, each with its own standards of proof and limits of resolution. Where those standards overlap, broad agreement forms. Where they diverge, uncertainty remains. That uncertainty does not dissolve with repetition. It remains present as long as the underlying constraints remain unchanged. One reason the question persists is the nature of the surviving record. The Sphinx lacks a construction inscription, foundation deposit, or administrative text that explicitly names a builder or a date. In a culture that recorded many such details elsewhere, this absence is noticeable. It invites attention without providing resolution. Scholars can describe what is missing with precision, but they cannot replace it. The gap remains fixed, regardless of how often it is discussed. The monument's physical form reinforces this condition. Carved directly from bedrock, the Sphinx does not sit within a sealed construction layer that can be excavated and dated. There is no buried cornerstone or datable fill beneath it. The act of carving removed context rather than enclosing it. This distinguishes the Sphinx from built structures whose foundations preserve chronological information. The method of construction limits the kinds of questions that can be answered archaeologically. Environmental interaction adds further complexity. Weathering patterns suggest long exposure histories, but those histories are interrupted by burial, clearance, and repair. Each interruption resets conditions. As a result, surface features accumulate in non-linear ways. This prevents simple correlation between erosion depth and elapsed time. Because erosion is visible and intuitive, it invites interpretation, yet its meaning remains conditional. Public familiarity with the Sphinx also plays a role. The monument is widely recognized, reproduced, and symbolically charged. Questions about it reach beyond academic circles. When a monument is well known but partially undocumented, curiosity persists. New interpretations attract attention even when they do not introduce new data. The persistence of the question reflects the monument's cultural visibility as much as its archaeological complexity. Scholarly debate itself sustains interest. Disagreement does not imply disorder, but it does keep questions open. When specialists publish differing interpretations based on the same observations, the range of plausible views becomes visible. Readers outside the field often interpret this as unresolved conflict, rather than methodological variation. The distinction between disagreement over weighting and disagreement over facts is not always clear in public discussion. The language used to describe age contributes to persistence. Terms such as older, earlier, or pre-dynastic are often used without precise definition. These terms can describe different spans depending on context. When definitions shift, conclusions appear to shift as well. This creates the impression of instability, even when underlying data remain constant. Precision reduces this effect, but popular discourse rarely maintains it. Another factor is comparison. Other ancient monuments possess clearer documentation, allowing their dates to be stated with confidence. The contrast highlights the Sphinx's ambiguity. This contrast encourages the assumption that clarity should exist here as well. When it does not, the absence feels unresolved rather than expected. The comparison sets an expectation that the evidence cannot meet. Technological advancement sustains the question by renewing hope for resolution. Each new method, from seismic testing to laser scanning, is seen as a potential breakthrough. These methods refine understanding of structure and condition. They rarely produce absolute dates. When results do not close the question, attention shifts to the next technique. The cycle continues without altering the fundamental constraints. Institutional boundaries also matter. Research at the Sphinx is subject to conservation priorities and access restrictions. Excavation is limited. Sampling is controlled. These constraints protect the monument, but restrict the kinds of data that can be collected. This is a deliberate trade-off rather than a failure of inquiry. The question persists because it is framed narrowly. Asking how old the Sphinx is implies a single moment of origin. The evidence instead describes a long process of carving, modification, repair, and reinterpretation. When a question seeks a single answer from a layered record, dissatisfaction follows. The record resists compression into one date. Cultural narratives also influence persistence. The idea of a monument predating known civilization carries symbolic weight. It suggests lost knowledge or forgotten builders. Even when such narratives are not supported by evidence, they shape how questions are asked. The persistence of the question reflects the persistence of these narratives, alongside academic analysis. Within scholarship, persistence is managed through qualification rather than resolution. Publications state what can be supported and what remains open. This practice preserves credibility, but leaves room for continued inquiry. The question remains present because it has not been eliminated by evidence, only bounded by it. The Sphinx's continuous visibility contributes to this condition. Unlike buried or ruined sites, it stands intact enough to invite scrutiny. Visitors see weathered stone and altered features without seeing the processes that produced them. Visibility invites interpretation. Interpretation invites questions. The monument does not recede into the past, it remains physically present. Educational framing reinforces this cycle. Introductory materials often present the Sphinx as mysterious or debated. This framing encourages curiosity rather than closure. Once established, such framing is repeated. The question becomes part of how the monument is introduced, rather than a problem to be resolved. Persistence becomes structural. The role of silence in the record cannot be overstated. Silence is not neutral. It draws attention. Where texts are expected and absent, silence becomes an object of interpretation. Different scholars assign different meanings to it. Some treat it as accidental loss, others treat it as significant omission. The disagreement over how to read silence keeps the question active. The monument scale amplifies this effect. Large structures suggest large efforts. Large efforts are expected to leave records. When records are not found, the discrepancy invites explanation. This expectation may not account for variability in record survival, but it shapes perception nonetheless. Time depth further complicates matters. Over millennia, documentation decays, landscapes change, and meanings shift. The Sphinx sits near a threshold where evidence becomes thinner. Questions at this threshold persist because they cannot be pushed further back without losing support. The academic process itself allows questions to persist without resolution. Research does not require closure to continue. Questions can remain open as long as they are bounded and clearly defined. In this sense, persistence is not failure. It is a reflection of methodological honesty. The Sphinx endures physically while its documentation remains partial. This mismatch sustains inquiry. The monument does not provide the kind of evidence that would end debate. It provides enough to constrain it. That balance keeps the question active. As long as the Sphinx stands carved from the plateau, exposed to study but limited in what it can reveal, questions about its age will continue to be asked. They persist not because answers are withheld, but because the evidence permits more than one constrained interpretation. The question remains as part of the monument's scholarly context. What the stone allows us to say. The stone of the Sphinx does not speak in dates or names. It preserves physical relationships, material conditions, and traces of interaction. From these, certain statements can be made with care. Other statements cannot. Responsible interpretation begins by distinguishing between what the material record supports directly and what lies beyond its capacity. The limestone ridge from which the Sphinx was carved belongs to a known geological formation. Its stratigraphy has been mapped in detail across the Giza Plateau. The beds exposed in the Sphinx enclosure match those quarried for nearby temples and structures. This establishes that the monument is physically embedded in the same stone system as the surrounding Old Kingdom landscape. The stone itself allows that connection to be stated without qualification. The carving method is also legible. The enclosure was cut by removing large volumes of bedrock, leaving the statue isolated within a trench. Tool marks on exposed surfaces are consistent with known ancient stoneworking techniques used elsewhere on the plateau. These techniques rely on copper chisels, stone hammers, and abrasive finishing. The stone allows the conclusion that the carving was achieved using methods available in ancient Egypt, without requiring technologies outside that context. Material variation explains much of the monument's uneven preservation. Harder limestone beds retain sharper edges. Softer beds recede and fracture. This pattern appears in natural outcrops, quarry faces, and architectural blocks across Giza. The stone therefore allows the statement that differential erosion is expected and does not, by itself, indicate different carving dates for different parts of the monument. The surface records repeated exposure and protection. Burial under sand, limited wind abrasion, while concentrating salts at boundary zones. Clearance exposed new surfaces to air, moisture, and temperature change. Repairs altered drainage and introduced new materials. These cycles are visible in the stone as bands of decay, repair joints, and changes in texture. The stone allows the conclusion that the monument has not experienced continuous exposure since carving. Weathering features can be described but not uniquely dated. Rounded hollows, vertical grooves, flaking surfaces, and fractured ledges all correspond to known processes acting on limestone under varying conditions. The stone allows identification of possible mechanisms, such as wind abrasion, salt crystallization, runoff along joints, and chemical dissolution. It does not allow assignment of those mechanisms to specific centuries without additional assumptions. The head and body differ in condition due to material strength and exposure history. The head is carved from a more durable bed and remained exposed longer. The body includes weaker layers and was buried for extended periods. The stone allows this explanation because it aligns with measured properties and documented burial history. It does not require a difference in carving age to account for the contrast. architectural context provides further constraints. Blocks quarried from the enclosure appear in nearby temples. The causeway passes close to the southern wall. Elevations and alignments fit the broader plateau plan. The stone allows the statement that the Sphinx is integrated into a construction landscape associated with the 4th dynasty. It does not allow certainty about whether carving occurred early or late within that program, or whether planning evolved during execution. The absence of an inscription naming a builder is a fact of the record. The stone allows that absence to be acknowledged. It does not allow inference about why the inscription is absent. Loss, reuse, erosion, or deliberate omission cannot be distinguished materially. The stone preserves no trace of intent regarding documentation. Restoration history imposes further limits. Modern mortars, replacement blocks, and drainage cuts altered original surfaces. Some weathering features visible today formed after exposure in the 20th century. The stone allows identification of these interventions through material mismatch and documented repair phases. It does not allow reconstruction of pre-clearance surface conditions in full detail. Comparative analysis supports cautious placement within a technological and cultural horizon. Tool marks, quarry methods, and associated masonry align with Old Kingdom practices known elsewhere. The stone allows placement within that horizon as plausible. It does not allow exclusion of all earlier activity, because similar techniques could exist without leaving distinct signatures. Claims that require precise numerical dating exceed what the stone can provide. Limestone does not contain isotopic clocks that record carving events. Radiocarbon dating applies only to associated organic material, which reflects human presence rather than stone modification. The stone allows relative sequencing but not absolute age measurement. Astronomical claims face similar limits. Orientation can be measured accurately. The Sphinx faces east within a narrow range. The stone allows that measurement. It does not preserve evidence of intended celestial targets. Without textual confirmation, alignment remains geometric rather than chronological. The stone also allows recognition of continuity. The monument remained meaningful across multiple periods. Repairs, offerings, and inscriptions attest to long-term engagement. This continuity implies that later cultures perceive the Sphinx as ancient. The stone allows that perception to be documented through context and alteration. It does not convert perception into proof of extreme antiquity. Uncertainty itself is a product of evidence boundaries. The stone preserves enough information to rule out some claims while leaving others open. For example, it does not support the idea that the Sphinx was carved with unknown materials or techniques. It does not support continuous exposure under a single climate regime. It does support prolonged interaction with environment and society. Methodologically, the stone demands restraint. Statements that follow directly from observed properties remain stable across disciplines. Statements that require extrapolation depend on assumptions that must be stated and tested. The stone allows the first category. It resists the second, when assumptions cannot be independently verified. In academic practice, this distinction defines responsible interpretation. What the stone allows to be said is bounded by measurement, comparison, and documented context. Beyond those bounds, language shifts from description to hypothesis. The stone itself does not authorize that shift. The Sphinx therefore functions as a limiting case. It is prominent, well-studied, and materially complex. It demonstrates how much can be learned from stone and how much cannot. Its surface records interaction rather than origin. Its context records association rather than authorship. The monument allows statements about process. It allows description of carving, weathering, repair, and reuse. It allows placement within a landscape shaped by known cultural practices. It allows recognition of long-term environmental interaction. These statements are cumulative and supported. It does not allow a single founding moment to be isolated. It does not allow assignment of a precise date without external documentation. It does not allow intent to be inferred from geometry alone. These limits are not failures, they are properties of the evidence. What remains is a disciplined boundary. Within that boundary, the stone is informative and reliable. Outside it, interpretation becomes speculative. The value of the monument to scholarship lies in respecting that boundary, rather than attempting to cross it without support. The Sphinx endures because its stone holds form under change. It also endures as a case study in how evidence constrains knowledge. What the stone allows us to say is substantial, but not exhaustive. It defines a space where careful description replaces definitive claims, age as a range, not a point. When scholars discuss the age of the Sphinx, they rarely speak in single dates. Instead, they work with intervals, overlaps, and boundaries. This approach reflects the nature of the available evidence. Stone monuments carved from bedrock do not preserve the moment of their creation in a way that can be isolated and measured. What they preserve is duration. Age, in this context, becomes a span rather than an instant. Chronological ranges emerge from the convergence of independent constraints. Architectural association places the Sphinx within a landscape shaped intensively during the 4th dynasty. Textual references establish that it was already ancient by the New Kingdom. Geological processes define what kinds of surface change are plausible within certain environmental windows. None of these constraints fixes a starting year. Together, they define a corridor of time. Within Egyptology, such corridors are common. Many temples, statues, and reliefs are assigned to periods rather than dates. Even when a king's reign is known, individual projects may span decades. Repairs, additions, and alterations blur boundaries further. The Sphinx, which has undergone repeated modification, exemplifies this condition at an extreme scale. Its age cannot be reduced to a single reign without ignoring later interventions and earlier unknowns. Probability plays a central role. Scholars assess how likely it is that carving occurred within a given period based on known patterns of labour organisation, quarrying practice, and monument planning. The 4th dynasty represents a peak of large-scale stone carving at Giza. That makes it a high-probability window. Probability, however, is not certainty. It expresses relative likelihood based on comparative data, not direct proof. Ranges also account for uncertainty and exposure history. A surface that appears heavily weathered may have been exposed longer, or it may have been exposed under harsher conditions. Burial under sand interrupts exposure, clearing resumes it. Without precise records of these cycles, erosion cannot be converted into years with confidence. Dating therefore remains bracketed by minimums and maximums rather than pinpointed. Minimum ages are often easier to establish. The Dream Stela of Thutmose IV provides a clear lower bound. By the 15th century BCE, the Sphinx existed, was revered, and was partially buried. This establishes that carving predates that period by an unknown margin. Stone allows this minimum to be stated confidently. It does not indicate how much earlier carving occurred. Maximum ages are more tentative. Geological context shows that the limestone ridge existed long before human activity. That does not imply early carving. Archaeological context suggests intensive quarrying and monument construction during the Old Kingdom. This sets a practical upper boundary within mainstream scholarship. Earlier dates are not supported by direct evidence, but neither are they entirely excluded by stone alone. The upper boundary remains conditional. Ranges can be expressed differently depending on discipline. An Egyptologist may frame age in dynastic terms. A geologist may frame it in relation to climatic phases. A conservator may frame it in relation to documented interventions. Each range overlaps but does not coincide exactly. Translating between them requires care. Misalignment between frameworks can give the impression of disagreement when scholars are operating at different scales. Formal models sometimes attempt to integrate these ranges. Bayesian approaches, for example, can combine independent constraints to produce probability distributions. Such models require explicit assumptions about relationships between variables. At the Sphinx, those relationships are not fully defined. As a result, probabilistic models remain exploratory rather than decisive. They illustrate uncertainty rather than resolve it. The language used to describe ranges matters. Terms like at least, no later than, and most likely signal boundaries. These terms are often misread outside academic contexts as evasive. Within scholarship, they are markers of precision. They indicate where evidence ends and inference begins. The Sphinx's age is discussed in this language because it reflects the evidence accurately. Historical comparison reinforces this approach. Other ancient monuments without inscriptions are dated through similar means. Rock-cut tombs, quarries, and statues often lack explicit dates. Their ages are inferred from context, style, and association. In many cases, ranges of several centuries are accepted without controversy. The Sphinx attracts attention because its range overlaps with broader questions about early civilization, not because its dating method is unusual. Ranges also accommodate revision. When new data emerge, boundaries can shift without overturning the entire framework. A newly discovered inscription could narrow the range dramatically. Improved climate reconstructions could adjust erosion expectations. Conservation findings could refine exposure history. The range model allows for such adjustments without requiring complete reinterpretation. Public discourse often seeks definitive answers. A single date is easier to communicate than a range. Scholars resist reducing ranges to points because doing so misrepresents uncertainty. The persistence of the range is therefore a feature of responsible practice rather than indecision. The concept of age as a range also reflects how ancient construction occurred. Large projects unfolded over time. Quarrying, carving, transport, and finishing did not happen simultaneously. Even if the Sphinx were carved within a single reign, its creation likely spanned years. Assigning a single year would misrepresent that process. A range better reflects the reality of labor and planning. Cultural perception of age differs from scientific measurement. Ancient observers described monuments as old without specifying duration. Their sense of antiquity was qualitative. Modern measurement seeks quantitative precision. The gap between these perspectives contributes to ongoing discussion. Ranges bridge that gap by acknowledging time depth without over-precision. The Sphinx's long history of repair further complicates matters. Ancient restorations may have altered original surfaces. Later additions may obscure earlier work. These changes mean that what survives is not a snapshot of a single moment. It is a composite. Dating the composite requires acknowledging multiple phases. A range accommodates this multiplicity. Environmental variability reinforces the need for ranges. Climate did not change abruptly. Conditions shifted gradually. Stone responded gradually. Any attempt to align erosion features with specific climatic events involves uncertainty. Ranges allow alignment without false exactness. Within academic literature, the Sphinx is often described using cautious phrasing that reflects this approach. Statements emphasize consistency with certain periods rather than exclusive attribution. This language is deliberate. It communicates probability while avoiding claims that exceed evidence. Critiques of the range approach often arise from misunderstanding its purpose. A range is not a refusal to decide. It is a decision about how to represent uncertainty. It defines what can be supported and where speculation begins. For the Sphinx, this decision preserves credibility across disciplines. The monument's prominence ensures that its range remains visible. As long as the Sphinx is discussed, the range is restated. This repetition can appear as stagnation. In reality, the range narrows incrementally as methods improve. The process is slow because the evidence is constrained. Age as a range also invites comparison with other monuments whose ranges overlap. This situates the Sphinx within broader patterns of early monumental activity. It becomes part of a continuum rather than an outlier. This contextualization reduces the pressure to assign extreme dates without support. Ultimately, the range reflects respect for the record. It acknowledges what is known and what is not. It resists the temptation to force closure where none is warranted. The Sphinx's age, expressed as a range, remains open enough to accommodate future discovery and closed enough to exclude unsupported claims. The stone supports this approach. It preserves sequences and associations, not timestamps. The scholarly response mirrors that reality. Age is treated as a span defined by constraints rather than a point fixed by decree. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like it. Subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this.